Colonization from another perspective. How do people really understand what they are taught? How does one become part of a group of people that belong to a certain or specific type of larger community? What does it mean to be overtaken by a group of people from another part of the world? In the film, Dances with Wolves, we watch and hear a man learn a new language, become part of a tribe that is much different from the people he has lived with, and witness how he becomes so much like the Sioux Indians he comes in contact with that he is eventually rejected by his own people. In this film, we learn about the lives of Sioux Indians during a time when they were still free to live in their native land before colonization took hold. Investigating the film Dances with Wolves from a symbolic interaction perspective and the theory of the self in relation to symbols, becoming part of a community, and the way indigenous people were treated when being colonized may help us understand why this story captures our hearts and minds when thinking about American Indians before colonization. This film opens up with Lieutenant John Dunbar in critical condition. His foot is injured and the Army medical staff want to cut it off so his injury does not worsen and infect him more. After the medical staff walks away, he struggles to get his boot back on his foot and rejoins the troops in the field. John heroically gets on his horse and rides between the gunfire and survives. Of course, this impressed his commanding officer and he was able to get the proper medical help for the injuries he had. John asked to be placed on the frontier for his next assignment. One of the reasons John stated he wanted to go to the frontier was to be able to see the frontier before it was gone. Although the men at Fort Hays could not understand why John wanted to see the frontier, they sent him on his way with a companion by the name of Timmons to guide him to Fort Sedgwick. When they arrived at Fort Sedgwick, John and Timmons unloaded the wagon so John could repair and set up the fort. It didn't seem to take long for John to get the fort set up and to feel safe in this strange new place. Eventually, an Indian by the name of Kicking Bird showed up at his fort, was curious, and wanted to pet his horse. At first, John seemed afraid, but then John briskly walked toward the unknown Indian, demanding to know what he wanted. Kicking Bird had no idea what noises John was making with his voice, and became extremely frightened. Kicking Bird quickly ran away from John, got on his horse, and rode away, leaving John standing there without knowing what to think. The second time the Indians and John meet face to face is when he returns a woman by the name of Stands with a Fist to the tribe. Sadly, John found her in the wilderness hurting herself. He didn't know what to expect, but figured it was worth trying to make contact with her people. After John returned her, the tribe leaders met and decided to make contact with John at his fort. After making this decision, Kicking Bird spoke with Stands with a Fist to ask her if she would try to make the white man's sounds, which are words, so they would be able to communicate with John. From this point forward in the film, John and the Sioux Indians got to know each other and learned from each other through symbols, language, and behavior. It was also discovered in the film that Stands with a Fist was white and was separated by her family because the Pawnee Indians killed her family when she was very young. It was clear the Sioux Indians found her and raised her as one of their own. One of the biggest questions and concerns the Indians had was whether or not there would be more white men coming and or invading their land. Eventually, John let Kicking Bird know there would be a lot of white people coming in the future. In fact, he let them know there would be as many white men coming as there are stars. Eventually, John goes back to his fort one last time to get his journal. He stopped for a moment looking at his fort only to become a target for the soldiers that were there. John was taken into captivity by the soldiers and his horse Cisco was slain. John tried to explain that this fort was where he was stationed, but they didn't want to listen and accused him of turning Injun. Luckily, the Indians came back for John, who was now called Dances with Wolves, fought against the soldiers, and they were able to return back to the tribe with John so he could be reunited with his new wife, Stands with a Fist. John and Stands with a Fist eventually go their own way to not bring danger to the Sioux Indians. At the end of the film, the audience is informed that 13 years later, the Sioux Indian homes were destroyed, the buffalo were gone, and the last of the free Sioux Indians gave into white authority at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. As we learned from George H. Mead in his theory of symbolic interactionism, is that language is an important symbol that helps us come to an understanding of what things are and what they mean. Symbols include things considered to be concrete, abstract, gestures which are considered nonverbal language, and verbal language. An example of language as an important symbol in this film is when Kicking Bird asks Stands with a Fist to make the sounds of the white man so they can communicate with the soldier at the fort. As the film continues, Stands with a Fist helps John Dunbar understand the words the Indians are saying to him. Another example of the preparatory stage and symbols is when the Indians and John go to and from the fort and the tribe's home to get to know each other. They teach each other what different items are through gestures, which again are symbols, by showing what the items are with words and by sharing. For example, John showed them how to grind coffee, and he also shared his sugar. It was funny when Wind in his hair liked the flavor of sugar so much that he grabbed a handful of it and then impulsively put some in his cup, and then he put some in Kicking Bird's cup, not thinking about how Kicking Bird would feel about it. Another example is when John was putting his fingers by his temples and hopping around in the dirt trying to imitate a buffalo. This is when John learned the word Tatanka in the Lakota language was the same word as buffalo in the English language. In fact, we attach meanings to symbols which allow us to have an emotional response or a mental understanding about different things in our environment. Being able to communicate helped them understand each other when they interacted. It is important to remember that the quote-unquote I and the quote-unquote me interplay with each other as one is growing and learning about themselves in their community. The me part of the self is more than just interacting with symbols and imitating what others are doing. At this point, each person is relating with each other. Maybe not as a group, but at least with one other person. It is when two people that are interacting understand there is an organized way of role-taking. Not only is it important to understand symbols or language to communicate, but it is also important to learn about the rules and responsibilities in a community. For example, John Dunbar initially had to learn how to imitate, and then he learned how to get along with others by learning how to trade and take turns. There was a moment in the film when Wind in his hair gave John Dunbar his chest plate, and John gave Wind in his hair his jacket. Afterward, John said it was a good trade. Shortly thereafter, when John saw his hat on one of the other Indians, he wanted it back. Wind in his hair could see that John wanted it back. So, to solve the issue, Wind in his hair told the Indian with the hat to either give it back or trade. Of course, this happened with the whole tribe watching. When the trade was done, Wind in his hair turned to John and said, "Good trade." The Indians and John were role-playing with one another, which helped to develop the concept of you and me in the relationship through their interaction. As John learned more about how he relates to the tribe, he started to be seen more and more by the Indians as one of them. In other words, the relationship between John and the tribe changed over time and became more intimate. He became so well versed with understanding their customs and traditions that he became accustomed to the attitude of the whole Sioux community, or what George Meade would call the generalized other. He knew their language, how to behave, and dressed like they did. One day, when they saw him chasing a wolf in the wilderness, the Indians decided to give him his own Sioux name. That was how he acquired the name, Dances with Wolves, and an example of how the Indians saw him as part of their community. Throughout the film, John was asked by Kicking Bird if he knew if there would be more white people coming. John decided not to let him know there would definitely be more coming until much later in the film, when it appeared that John saw himself as one of the Sioux Indians and not as a soldier. Another example of becoming a part of the whole community is when Kicking Bird's wife mentions to Kicking Bird that Stands with a Fist was no longer mourning and was in love with Dances with Wolves. He asked her what the others in the tribe thought of the match, and she let him know the tribe liked the idea. The entire tribe attended the wedding and celebrated. In other words, he became a part of the group and was no longer a soldier in their eyes. There was even a moment in the film where John narrated that perhaps his name, John Dunbar, had no meaning, but as he heard his name, Dances with Wolves, he knew who he was. He was one of them and was no longer a white man. As the tribe was packing up to move to their winter home, Dances with Wolves decides to go back to the fort he lived at as John Dunbar for the final time to get his journal because he did not want the army to find it. Unfortunately, he is faced with soldiers that overtook his fort, was brutally shot at, taken captive, beaten, and treated as less than an animal. According to Seidman, a part of colonization is to deny someone their freedom, integrity, and self-respect. I also thought about how Fanon said that the heart of empire is the dehumanization of the native, and that many colonizers felt it was or is their duty to enlighten and educate humanity in the proper way to live. What we learn from the meanings behind the Indians becoming the colonized is that those doing the colonizing did not think about the people and the culture they were erasing. Sadly, those being colonized were either suppressed or destroyed, which, as we learned at the end of the film, the way of life for the Sioux Indians did come to an end. However, by treating John Dunbar like a native, they were ultimately letting him know he was inferior to them. In fact, calling him an Injun was a symbol that was meant to be an insult, but to John it seemed an honor to be considered a native. John was so much a part of the Sioux culture that he no longer spoke English and instead spoke the Sioux language. He did not care if the soldiers saw him as an Indian because in his mind he had recreated himself. He no longer belonged to the white man's community. What is neat is that not only did John feel like he finally knew who he was in the world, but the Sioux tribe also felt that he was one of them. He was so important to his tribe that they came back and rescued him from his captors. It was also vital to John that the tribe not be in danger by his presence. So he left the tribe with his new wife, Stands with a Fist, with the goal to try to get someone to listen to the truth about the Sioux Indians. They were not thieves and beggars, and instead good people. John learned a way of life through symbols and community with the Sioux tribe and could no longer imagine any other way to live. Today, we teach our young to learn how to communicate through symbols such as language, learn to take on the role of the other, and eventually they share our values and norms in our society.